Welcome. So we are featuring Dr. Amy Morrison. She's a naturopathic doctor here at Nirvana Health. She focuses primarily on chronic inflammatory conditions, primarily chronic inflammatory response syndrome, or CIRS. She also does a lot of work with Lyme tick-borne illness, mental health, concussions, digestive concerns, and much more. So welcome, Dr. Amy Morrison, and thank you so much for the presentation, Wired for Survival, the Brain's Response to Emotional Trauma.
Thanks, Melissa. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to this presentation. This is a deep passion of mine on the side of what I do for practice, but one of the reasons that I talk so much about trauma in my practice is because a lot of people have trauma, and a lot of people with chronic health conditions have trauma or some sort of trauma or overwhelm to the nervous system. And so when people come in, as Melissa said, I deal a lot with chronic inflammatory response syndrome. Basically, in these conditions, what happens is our nervous system is upregulated at some point, and when we're in that upregulated or survival state, it's going to prevent our body from healing a lot of these other conditions that I work with. So, people might not necessarily be coming in for trauma right off the bat. Some people do, of course, but some people don't know that potentially this is impeding their system from healing. And so when we do, at Nirvana, we do something called brain mapping and neurofeedback, or quantitative EEG. And with this, we can see the data in that type of testing, which we'll go over a little bit at the end, some of those images, where their system might be preventing or where that block can be potentially from trauma. So that's why this is a big part of my practice. This is why I talk a lot about this is, okay, if we're not recovering from the conditions that I work with in a way that we would typically expect, is there a trauma component to that? And so it can really help to click and solidify a lot of the treatment protocols that we're doing when we address this underlying nervous system dysregulation due to trauma or something else that can be causing that. Because a lot of times with treatments, it's like, this should work. This should work. We've been doing these things. We're getting more in these smaller boxes. We're restricting more food. We're taking more and more supplements, but we're not getting the same outcomes that we would expect or that we would want. And it's like, okay, there's something else going on, and what that might be. So we'll get more into these kind of deeper states. And so we're going to look at the nervous system side of things first. What actually is trauma? What regions of the brain are potentially keeping us stuck in the state? Why are they doing that? And then, of course, what to do about it. So as Melissa said, if you have any questions along the way, put them in the question box there, and we'll definitely address those at the end. So to start, let's talk about the nervous system first. So the autonomic nervous system, as the name suggests, is an automatic response that we basically go between the 2 or 3 states that you'll see on here: parasympathetic, sympathetic, and dorsal vagal. So you can think of almost like that parasympathetic and sympathetic as like a gas and a brake pedal, and they're both going to be on at the same time. Whatever pedal is down more, that system is going to be driving. The other one's still on then in the background, but it's not going to have more power over the other one. And so what can happen, ideally, we're more in that parasympathetic state. You can see on here, that's like rest, digest, social connection. Like that name says, that's what the state that we need to be in order to digest our food. And so when we go into rest and digest, or that parasympathetic side of things, you can think of all of that blood flow going into the internal organs. We're going to have more digestive secretion, so pancreatic enzymes being secreted, more HCl, something called peristalsis, or the way that our food moves north to south throughout the intestinal tract happens, right? We have more nutrient absorption. So digestion, we need to be in that rest and digest to optimize digestion. And then we can have like slower heart rate, our breathing slows down, we have more saliva secretion, we have more tear production. And so this is going to be what we need to be in order for our body to heal and rest and recover. One of the other things is a good insight to potentially where your body might sit when it comes to, which nervous system state you might be more of the time. Like bowel movements and urination have a lot to do with safety, right? And so when we feel safe to have a bowel movement, we can have a bowel movement. So a lot of this digestion, a lot of people can have digestive issues. And so that's another big part of my practice. When potentially we are more constipated, it might be because our body actually doesn't feel safe to do this vulnerable activity, right? And so that's where we want to be in most of the time. And then we want to shift into that sympathetic or that fight or flight. So you can think of, again, like we're fighting or running away. All of that blood flow is going into our extremities. We're increasing sweating. We're taking in more oxygen. Our heart rate goes up. We do whatever we need to do in that fight or flight. And then ideally, we go back into rest and digest. We're recovering there. If we get stuck in that fight or flight for a long period of time, or like that chronic activation, that third state here, that dorsal vagal, that freeze, that shutdown, this can be almost like our last ditch effort. So we're in fight or flight for a long period of time. At some point, our system's gonna be like, I need a minute, right? And we can go in that dorsal vagal shutdown. That's actually not relaxation or where we're relaxing. That can be more of an emotional numbness. And so it can feel like a break, but it's actually, we're just in this overwhelmed state. And so one of the kind of classic examples to separate these three different nervous system states is that lion and zebra example. So if you're a zebra hanging out, not doing too much, you're in that parasympathetic or rest and digest. A lion comes along and starts chasing you, you're going to be running or fighting for your life, right? And then if you get away, you're going to be going back into that rest and digest. You're going to shake it all off. You're going to be relaxing again. But if you're running from that lion and that lion catches you, and then you have to go into that dorsal vagal, it's like your last ditch effort to hope that that lion gets bored, and then you can survive, right? If you faint or freeze, maybe the lion will get bored and leave you alone. And then you're still okay. One of the biggest things with these three states is when we're more used to being in that sympathetic fight or flight state, it can actually feel really uncomfortable to go back into a rest and digest state, or that parasympathetic state. It's like, yeah, I don't know, I'm really used to this fight or flight. That rest and digest feels a little bit scary, and so, or unsafe, or which we'll talk more about with the brain side of things of why that's happening. And so it's harder to just tell people, you just need to relax, right? Like, I'm like, okay, just go home and sit down. And then your brain goes to more towards, I need to create a grocery list. What am I doing tomorrow? What am I doing next year? What am I doing in 10 years? Your brain's trying to pull you out of that rest and digest. So it's like, no, I feel more comfortable in this fight or flight. So it's not as easy to bounce between these systems as it might perceivably be. We tend to like what we're used to. And so really from a underneath, like underground layer of all this, with this automatic nervous system, we want that flexibility and adaptability to go between these states. But when we get stuck into one, then that's where it can become an issue. Yes, okay. So we have our autonomic nervous system. That's going to be how all of that information is transported to your brain through all of those nerves. But we also want to define what trauma actually is. And so this talk does say it's geared more towards emotional trauma, but actually in our brain, emotional trauma, mental trauma, physical trauma, spiritual trauma, all type of trauma can be actually stored the same way. And so it doesn't have to be so specific to emotional trauma. Trauma is going to be any type of physiological or psychological response to an experience that overwhelms that nervous system. So, okay, there's something that happened and internally we feel overwhelmed. And Gabor Mate, if you guys are ever heard of him or a fan of him, one of his sayings is trauma is not the event itself, it's how the body responds when that event occurs. And this is actually how people can go through the same event and have a completely different outcome or activation in their body. So, you know, siblings can grow up in the same household and something happens with the parents or in their environment, and two siblings can have absolutely completely different outcomes to the same similar event, even though the parents were the same or the event was the same. It's like, no, actually that what happened internally to each individual could be completely different. Then we develop that perceived or a story or a narrative that comes out of that event that happened. And then that's actually what we're going to carry along for the rest of our life until we become aware of whatever that was created inside us. And so there's two different types of trauma. Well, there's lots, but we're going to put it down into these two groups. So big T trauma is more of like the big acute events that you think of. Something's happening to you. Potentially there's a loss or a grief or more of abuse or a rape or a situation that's like this acute event that happened, which is actually less common than this little T trauma, which typically around 80% of the people have this little T trauma. And this little T trauma is something that can be more repetitive. It's usually something that you actually don't get. So big T is like something happened to you, and little t is something you needed something in that moment. And now that wasn't actually met. That need wasn't met. And a lot of the times with little t trauma, actually 70% of the population will have some sort of trauma that happens before they're 18 years old. So this is where childhood trauma comes in. But as a child, you are, well, one, you're like a sponge. So all of the energies around you and all of the way your parents are being and their outlook on the world, you are just going to absorb all of that energy and take all of that on. But then two, as a child or a baby, you are 100% dependent on your caregivers. And so what that means with this little t trauma is when you need something, you need everything from your parents. And if your parents don't meet that need, or I should say, if your caregiver doesn't meet that need, or potentially something at school doesn't meet that need, you're going to be like, okay, if I showed up in this authentic way and I was hungry, or I needed love, or I needed affection, and I actually didn't get that need met, then I need to change my behavior in order to now try and get that need from somebody else, because I can't give it to myself. You're a child, right? You're dependent on somebody else or something to care for you. And so this is where a lot of this underlying trauma comes from, is because, okay, I have a need and it's not being met. So that's going to be the little t trauma. What happens when this happens, when this trauma happens when we're little, is again, I have this need, it's not met. And then we create these stories, or we start to wear different masks. And with these masks, it's like, okay, in order for me to get X, Y, Z, I need to show up in the world in a different way. And so kids usually learn that being authentic isn't going to get their needs met. So I need to behave differently. I need to put my needs last. I need to put someone else's needs first. I need to be able to control everything in my external environment in order to get X, Y, Z. I need to push myself harder. I need to show up. I need to be better. I need to be smarter, because that is how your needs were met when you were younger, instead of it just being met for who you truly are and authentic. And as we get older, typically, like these ways or patterns or protective strategies that we have developed over time won't work anymore. So usually 20 to 30 years later, as we become more into adulthood, these protective patterns and strategies that we developed to get something, our needs met when we were young, now actually cause more harm than good. And they cause more harm to ourselves and also people that we're in relation with. So relationships for sure, but also friendships, maybe work environments, they're not going to work the same way anymore. And then our nervous system doesn't understand. It's really confused. I showed up like this for however many years of my life, 20, 25 years, and this is how I got my needs met. And then something's going to shift and happen. And now when I show up this way, my needs not met anymore. This is really confusing. I'm really stressed. What do I have to do? I don't understand. And so that in and of itself is also going to activate that nervous system, more fight or flight. It's really confusing. That survival mode is going to be there. And really it comes down to learning that most of these things that we have learned throughout childhood to get our needs met was like a value system that is technically based on like a lie, right? That is not true. You don't need to show up in that way. And so it's unlearning these responses and learning more about the brain and how this nervous system works so that we can rewrite that narrative, rewrite that story, so that now when we go into a relationship or whatever the situation might be, we can show up more from that authentic place versus more of that traumatized narrative or activation of the nervous system that's causing outcomes that potentially we might not be aware of. The other thing here is that, one of the reasons that I'm focusing more on childhood, like I mentioned earlier, is that we're like sponges. And so a lot of the times our narratives are going to be formed when we're really young, and then we're just going to take those into adulthood. And of course, as we are more aware, as we get older, we're actually just kind of peeling back the layers of the onion of stories or narratives that were already there from when we were really little. Of course, they can happen later in life, but it typically is going to be from some core memories that have developed in childhood. And so what we want to know with all of this information when we do the qEEG and brain mapping is, okay, what is happening in the brain? What structures are impacted? Because then that can help provide us more awareness of how to work with this information moving forward. So one of the first parts of the brain that we want to look at is something called our amygdala. Our amygdala is like that primal part of our brain. It is the question it asks over and over and over again is, am I safe? Am I safe? Am I safe? Am I safe? If the answer is yes, then we go more towards like creativity, connection, health, right? We want to be in safe. Like if we're going to compare and contrast survival mode versus thriving, we're going to be able to heal. Survival, our brain's like, we'll take care of that health condition later. And so if the answer is yes, we are safe, we get connection, creativity, health. When the answer is no, that's when it goes into survival mode. We're firing in that fight or flight nervous system. And then it's like all of these other things don't really matter. And especially when we're young and we're dependent on our caregivers 100% of the time, if our needs are not being met, then we can be put in that elevated stress response state for a really long period of time. And so then it's like your amygdala is just like, I'm never safe, right? We can be in survival mode for our whole childhoods and then take that into our whole adulthood. And when our amygdala feels overwhelmed with these situations, stress, trauma, then it actually can learn to adapt and fire that signal more quickly, even potentially when that state isn't actually a threat. So it's like, okay, there's this neutral or ambiguous state, but my whole past history has told me that I'm in survival. So I'm just going to squash this right away. We're just going to continue to be in survival, even though that situation is potentially not an issue. What this can lead to is more hypervigilance. So we're kind of like always on the lookout, scanning for threats in the outside world. It can lead to more jumpiness. So it's like something happens and we have this exaggerated response. I always remember a time when I was in ND school and we were in the clinic and my nervous system was for sure fried and I dropped a pen and my response was like, oh my goodness. And my supervisor was like, you just dropped a pen. Like, it's not a big deal. But in the moment, like my amygdala fired, adrenaline fired, like it was the end of the world in that moment, dropping the pen. And then my prefrontal cortex, which we'll talk about in a second, had to come in and like kind of talk me out of it. And it's like just so jumpy. We're just reacting to things all over the place. When our amygdala is also upregulated, we can always feel like we're on edge, right? So it's like we can never really quiet down or get into rest. It's always like there's like almost like this sense of danger that's always looming in the background. It will drive more anxiety, right? We're thinking about the future, the survival. Is there danger? Okay, we're going to have heightened anxiety. And then again, when we're in this state for a long enough period of time, our brain will go into that dorsal vagal response, that more of that emotional numbness. So that can also be a sign that our amygdala is upregulated over and over. One of the other signs I mentioned, like, okay, there's a neutral or ambiguous response, and we're just going to go right into that survival mode. But it can also come up like, you know, if somebody's just has a neutral facial expression and you're like, nope, that seems a bit scary and or a threat. And we're almost like intaking all of this data, thinking and looking at it as more of that survival response. We're just going to assume all of these situations, that facial expression, that minor conflict is going to be really catastrophic, or everything just seems bigger and more overwhelming than actually what that situation is in that moment. The other thing with the amygdala when it's really upregulated like this is because it's part of the emotional brain, you'll see on that bottom left-hand side there, it's like a fast automatic response. Like it's firing right away. There's no time, right? We're getting chased by a lion. There's no time to think about it. We're not thinking about anything. And so it's going to be really quick. But if it's on for a longer period of time, that chronic stress response, there's also going to be a longer return to baseline. So it's like, you know, something maybe happened this morning and now I'm still upregulated about it. It's taking me hours, days, months to actually be able to downregulate that stress response. And so it's like gets harder and harder the longer that we're in that upregulated state. So you can think of our amygdala as almost like that primal first stop in our brain. We've had chronic stress for a long period of time. We've told our amygdala that it needs to be on the lookout for danger, and that am I safe is just like overactive all the time. So that's going to be the first part. The second part of this, when our amygdala is upregulated, it then is going to communicate with something called our hypothalamus, which then will talk to our pituitary, which is then going to talk to our adrenal glands to fire that adrenaline and fire that cortisol. So a lot of the times when we talk about stress in our body, a lot of that chat will be around cortisol, testing cortisol levels, or even like that burnout state. It's almost like instead of burnout, now we're talking like saying HPA axis dysregulation. So they're kind of interchangeable when it comes around to what's actually happening in the body. So again, that cortisol, adrenaline is going to be released right away. which is our fast hormone. Cortisol is going to come right behind it. This is going to be where we feel those symptoms of that heart rate increasing. We're going to be more hypervigilant. We're going to have really narrowed attention. We're going to be, again, honed in on where's that lion, we are running, or whatever that threat is. Doesn't matter about where we put our keys or who that person was. Our focused attention is we're locked in right now, right? We're focused on survival. And so that's going to be kind of how we feel in the system with our cortisol. And the other thing with that cortisol being high for a long period of time, we have our two hemispheres in our brain, and there's like a bridge that is connecting them. It's called our corpus callosum. And when cortisol is high for a long period of time, it dwindles down that communication between the two regions of the brain. And so if you think about one region of the brain being like, this is the emotions that happened with that situation. And you think about the other side of the brain that's like, this is the details of what happened in that situation. And now they can't communicate anymore. We are going to have issues with how we feel. So some people will be able to like have a lot of emotions, but not really be able to recall a lot of detail that happened. And some people will have a lot of detail and not really have any emotions attached to it. And so that can be part of that communication pathway that's been disrupted there. And one of the good things with that corpus callosum or with cortisol is that when we can get cortisol levels back down, that communication will upregulate again, and we'll be able to integrate those memories, and people will kind of be able to put those pieces, like pieces of the story together and help to integrate that memory and integrate that process. So, you know, while that cortisol is still high, there's going to be an imbalance, but as long as we can get the cortisol levels down, then it's going to help with the brain function and integration, but it's also going to help from like a chronic health condition. Cortisol is going to drive a lot of mood disruption. It's going to drive a lot of immune system dysregulation. There's a lot of like sleep imbalances, hormone imbalances. And so there's going to be a lot of downstream effects to having cortisol high for a long period of time. Cortisol in itself is not bad. We need cortisol. Again, we need to run from that lion. But when it's high for long periods of time, that's when it become disruptive. So that's our HPA axis dysregulation. So we have our amygdala. It's going to trigger those responses that can impact the whole body there through that autonomic nervous system. Another big part of the brain here, I mentioned a little bit earlier, is something called our prefrontal cortex. So we have our amygdala. This is like that fast automatic response. And then we have our prefrontal cortex that's going to be more slow and deliberate, but it's only going to come online when your body feels safe to do so, right? So if you're running, we don't have time to think about this, right? We got to go. We got to get out of here. And so a lot of the times when the prefrontal cortex, like when we're under stress and our amygdala is going for a long period of time, our prefrontal cortex doesn't work as well, right? It's kind of like down regulated. And so it's like our executive control center. So if it's working really well, it can keep everything in check. And then when we're stressed, it's like, no, we're just going to be behind the scenes. And so then impulse control can come in, rational thinking can leave, that kind of calm response when it comes to a situation. We don't have that prefrontal cortex to regulate our response anymore. And one of the examples that I would give to like kind of show the amygdala versus that prefrontal cortex is if, you know, you come around a corner and your friend jumps out and scares you, you're going to get that whole flood of emotions of adrenaline running through your body. Your heart rate goes up. You can feel your heart in your chest, maybe sweating. You're like, am I going to punch this person? Do I need to yell? That's like that amygdala. It's the quick response. And then you're going to see, okay, I know this person. It's my friend. I don't have to punch them. I don't have to run. You guys can laugh about it. But that's going to be that second slow, deliberate response coming in, your brain actually processing what's happening. How do I have to react with this? And so we want to really make sure when we're working with trauma and the nervous system, again, bring the amygdala back down to a place where it's feeling safe so that our prefrontal cortex can actually come in and have a say or be a part of that discussion when your brain is talking, because without it, it's just like you'll see on the kind of right hand side here of the screen, but you can react really impulsively. We can have responses or judgments or say things that we don't mean. And it's because this guy's offline, right? We're not filtering our automatic response through something that might be like, yeah, actually, maybe that's not a good idea to say that, or maybe that's not a good response here. And so it can really help with that buffering when we can get that prefrontal cortex back online. Then the third big part of our brain and how this works is going to be something called our hippocampus. So our hippocampus is like our memory bank, right? We want to know what happened in the past so that going forward, we can make sure we're not going to put ourselves in that situation again, right? We had this trauma. No, thank you. That didn't make us feel good. And so we got to make sure that we're on high alert. So the hippocampus is going to be one of those things that's also like keeping us driven or stuck in that fight or flight mode. So when our hippocampus is working effectively, we're going to have really coherent timelines of what happened. When we go like what's happened then versus what's happening now. When we are under stress for a long period of time or that fight or flight is upregulated, it impairs this critical function. We don't have a chronological timeline of what happened. That volume of actually the hippocampus does shrink. And so we see that there's an impact like actually physiologically in the brain, and it disrupts our ability to now file new experiences appropriately. So what this can lead to is a lot of fragmented recall of the situations, what actually happened, when it happened, what order it happened. And that can also lead to more like invasive flashbacks of what happened, right? And so that can also be very triggering or activating to our nervous system. We can have those memory gaps and we can have like that emotional flooding. So the brain can actually relive the trauma. So it's not just the flashbacks, but it's like, is this actually happening right now again? And so that's where the hippocampus comes in. And what we want to do, again, get the amygdala back to a safe place, get this hippocampus to be able to come back online, take the volume back up, start filing those memories in an order that's actually that our brain can make sense of. And then this is going to help us integrate all of that information and get back to a place that we feel safe. When, with that hippocampus, again, it's similar to the amygdala in the sense of can perceive danger or think that it's perceiving danger from a situation that's neutral or not dangerous. So it's like, we're going to this, there's no real danger here, but it's close enough to the situation that I'm just going to be extra safe and cautious, and we're going to fire those fight or flight or that sympathetic dominant nervous system state. And this right here is the reason that, or one of the reasons that that parasympathetic or that rest and digest might not feel safe to some people. Because again, when we were young, back in childhood, and when I was authentic, I was vulnerable, and I showed up this way, and my needs weren't met, I learned that being vulnerable and authentic mean pain, rejection, which abandonment, and now I don't like these feelings. I don't like how this felt. And then, so then when we're in adults, it's like, oh, I've been in this rest and digest before. I've been authentic and vulnerable, and this didn't work out well for me, so I don't like to be here. And then it's going to pull us back into the fight or flight because this is what's more comfortable and feels safer for us. And so it's almost like being in this sympathetic dominant side of things or being on that high alert provides us with this false sense of safety and control over the situation, because that rest and digest, we have that memory of being uncomfortable and it didn't work out well for us. So it's going to pull us out. One of the other things with these two modes of parasympathetic to sympathetic is our nervous system really likes what's familiar. It doesn't like necessarily what's best for us. Again, that amygdala is like, am I safe? It doesn't care if you're happy. It doesn't care what brings you joy. It doesn't care if you're at peace. It just cares if you're safe. So same thing with our nervous system. When you're used to that fight or flight or upregulation, that parasympathetic state doesn't feel good enough or safe, right? Vulnerability doesn't feel safe. It's going to be like, okay, I can at least predict what is going to happen in this state. And this is where you can see a lot of the times where we all will, mostly all potentially, lead to situations that we repeat over and over and over again. Potentially we date the same person over and over and over again, even though it's different people. We enter the same jobs over and over and over again. We have friends that do the same things over and over and over again. It's because like, okay, actually I know what is going to happen in this situation. Last time when I was in this situation, it led to X, which led to Y, which led to Z. Okay, I know that that's what's going to happen. So I like that predictability and familiarity, and it will choose that every single time over the unknown, even though the unknown might be happiness, joy, peace, relaxation, right? It's not, it's the unknown is scarier than the familiar. And so that's how we can also get stuck in this nervous system state, because it's like, nope, this is actually more familiar. And so what we do with all of this is we're going to develop these strategies. We're young, we like these states, and then we get stuck in these strategies to protect us. So on here, like avoidance, a lot of people will avoid situations, will avoid conflict, because at some point in their life when they went into those, nope, we didn't like that, right? And so we're just going to continue to avoid. Same thing, we can be really defensive. We can develop that people-pleasing tendency, right? I had to please my parents. We learn to tune in with their moods. We learn to tune in with their needs when we're young. And when you tune in with them and when you act one way, then you got their need met. And when you walked the other way, you didn't get your need met. So now you're people-pleasing, right? And now as we go into adulthood, this can just continue and continue and continue, because that's familiar. When you show up like this is what you get, even though you might be damaging yourself in the meantime. Same thing with like controlling situations, always kind of looking for the external control. Once we can control everything in the external environment, we can feel safe internally. That is going to be, though, like that false sense of control, right? Because we're never going to be able to control everything. And so we're never going to be able to heal and get back to that state of rest and digest until everything's perfect, but that's never going to happen. And then numbing, that goes back into more of like with the dorsal vagal response, actually. So when we're in dorsal vagal and we're having that emotional numbing, we can't just jump into rest and digest. We have to go back through the sympathetic dominant or the fight or flight nervous system state before we can get rest into digest. That is like that polyvagal theory. And so what can happen is when we're emotionally numb for a very long period of time, in order to heal, we actually have to go into that fight or flight, which we will start feeling again. And it can be very uncomfortable. And it's like, actually, I really don't like this, but we need to be able to build capacity within the nervous system, which I'll talk about in a second, in order to handle or feel safe or know that that discomfort in that fight or flight is actually what we need to go through in order to get into rest and digest. So we can't just bypass that fight or flight. We do have to go through those emotions in order to be able to get back to that place of healing. One of the good things with all of this information is that when we are young and we are learning these things and we're in fight or flight and our amygdala is upregulated and our prefrontal cortex and our hippocampus, we have wired our brain to go on the lookout to make sure we're safe. And we've created all of these neuronal pathways and networks to always be on the lookout. I'm going to say more for the negative things. Of course, there's some things that we do need to be on the lookout for, but it's more of like those neutral, ambiguous situations that aren't happening. It's not real danger where we are firing this over and over. But we have rewired our brain or wired our brain that way to look out for those things and be really focused on those things. But the good thing about this is because we can wire it one way, that means we can rewire it the other way. And so what we want to do is, again, make sure our system feels safe. Then we can expand the capacity within our nervous system and rewire it to look out for things that we do want to attract, that we do want to bring in. We do feel safe. We can return our body to that homeostatic state when it comes to chronic healthcare conditions, of course. Our body is always going to want to return to the state that it's most efficient in energy, and it's usually all of these barriers that are blocking it from getting there. And so if we can remove those barriers in the body, we'll be able to flow back into that state. So we just want to help to rewire it to attract what we want to bring in. So there's many different, but couple different big points that we want to think about and look at when we do talk about like this, more of this rewiring pathway. So number one, I've said safety a couple times. So what that means is that we want to be, trauma is going to happen in relationship with somebody. And so we do want to heal that trauma in relationship with somebody. I don't mean relationship with your partner. It can be a therapist, it can be a practitioner, it can be a friend, but we want that environment to feel safe, where you can actually open up and be vulnerable and be authentic. And then we can slowly show your brain and nervous system and your body that there is a way to heal, that you can be in that state without having to, without expecting that danger to come in or that upregulation to happen every time. So that's going to be a huge thing, is like, okay, we need that safe space. And then there's kind of these on the screen here, there's those two approaches that you'll see on the left-hand side, that bottom up and top down. And so with the bottom up approach, this is typically going to be better for if our nervous system is really triggered or activated. Like it's like, okay, we're triggered over and over again. We can't necessarily talk about the situation, or we can't bring our nervous system to a place where it is more regulated. So we want to start from a bottom up. So this actually means like the structures in our brain, that primal brain, like the brain stem working up to the prefrontal cortex. So this can be things like somatic exercises, there's somatic therapy, breathing, yoga, pet therapy, things where we're getting back in the body, helping to regulate that expression. Versus top-down therapy, so where we go prefrontal cortex inwards, which can be more like talk therapy can work when we're actually in a place where we can regulate and work through or express what is happening or work through those emotions. And people are going to be drawn more to one potentially than the other. People have tried one probably more than the other. And so both ways we can use these to help integrate that information and rewire. And really what it comes down to is, okay, awareness of what's going on. Why is this happening in the system? What does it mean? What is that story? What is that narrative? Why am I feeling this way? We can have the awareness. The awareness of it in and of itself isn't enough to rewire anything, because knowledge, right? If you think of that prefrontal cortex versus our amygdala, we can have all the knowledge and awareness in the world, but if our amygdala is upregulated, that emotional brain is upregulated, it is going to fire and it is going to win every single time. So we need to have the knowledge, but then also integrate that into the amygdala. So what that means is, okay, we have the knowledge and awareness of what's going on. We learn that, like we know that pattern. We want to learn why that pattern's happening. We want to understand that pattern, and then we want to change that pattern. But how we do this to change is, okay, we need to, which is more on the right-hand side, that window of tolerance, is put ourselves in safe situations where we feel a little bit uncomfortable. So let's say, for example, if I were to hate public speaking and I'm going to do this presentation and it makes me feel really uncomfortable and I'm in fight or flight all the time, potentially I'm going to develop this presentation and I'm going to do this presentation just by myself. And then maybe I'm going to do this presentation by myself or in front of the mirror and looking at myself. And then I'm going to do this presentation in front of my mom, right? Or a friend, somebody that you know will just be open and loving. And then we're going to slowly grow that and expand that window of tolerance. So it's like, okay, now I'm feeling safe in each one of these. And it's really about knowing that it's okay to feel a bit of discomfort, but it's in this window of tolerance. So I'm here, I'm comfortable here, let's say, talking to myself. And then if I'm talking to my mom, I'm in this window of tolerance, I'm expanding that. But then if I talk in front of a room of 500 people, I'm totally shut down and I can't talk anymore. Okay, then this is going to be too much. And so what we want to do is slowly or help or open up that window of tolerance. And a lot of that window of tolerance can come from, again, learning why that pattern happened and why we would react like that. Because once there's awareness around a story or a narrative or why our reaction is the way it is, and then we can see the counter to that. So is that story absolutely true? It can really help to expand that window of tolerance. And so this is going to be, again, back to like everybody probably has a way that they're called to help with that. Like to help to integrate that information. So it's not everything is going to work for everybody is really what I'm trying to say with that. So we really want to make sure that we're finding something that works for you to help expand this window of tolerance, build the capacity within the nervous system. And then that is going to build resilience over and over and over time. And so the goal is never to eliminate that activation or eliminate that trigger, but it's going to be to build capacity within our nervous system so that when something happens, we're like, we got this, right? And then as we expand, it's going to be something new and something new and something new. And we always want to be expanding that capacity. So with the rewiring and integration of this information, basically what's going to do, that amygdala is going to become less reactive. Then our prefrontal cortex is going to be strengthened. We're going to regain that regulatory control. And then it's going to help to integrate those memories from your left and right hemisphere so that our hippocampus can have the chronological order of events that happened appropriately, right? And so we're not getting all of these different pieces of information. And then all of this is going to help to, again, expand that capacity so we're not so reactive. What we do or to rope in some of the data that we see, I just want to bring up these pieces of the brain that we do see with brain mapping and qEEGs that we do at Nirvana. I think I can blow these up. Let's see. I think you guys can see that okay. Yeah. So there's a couple of different diagrams here. And so this is going to be one more of how deep and where in the brain certain regions are upregulated or downregulated. Okay, I can't zoom in here. But you'll at the top here, these two words are hippocampus and amygdala. So those are going to be the two regions of the brain that we talked about for that overactivation. And when we see them really red like this, you can see that they're almost like hijacking the other regions of the brain to also be in that survival mode. And so what we want to do, well, neurofeedback, which is one of the treatments that we do at the clinic, again, not the only way, but what we work with is how can we integrate this information so that we are not in that elevated state, right? And so this is going to be one of those brain maps that we see, yes, we're upregulated, we're in survival. Versus, let's compare it to this one here, I guess that's okay, that you don't see any of that upregulation. There's a couple of those other regions of the brain are upregulated, but it's not going to be so intense and so red. Here is a diagram of those two regions of the brain and that corpus callosum in the middle, right? So we have some downregulation of communication happening between these two. This one isn't super severe, but it's just what I found. So, but it's a good representation of just those lines that we can see of how details and emotion might not be connected or adding up with that story. And then at the bottom here, this has to do more with heart rate variability. So with this, basically we're seeing as you're breathing out with a ball across, the ball goes across the screen and we're breathing in and out with it. Can we regulate? So we can see with this first one here, we can tell when we are breathing in and out with the ball. It does go up and down. As we breathe in, we go into that into that sympathetic nervous system side of things, into that fight or flight. And as we exhale, we go into that parasympathetic rest and digest side of things. So this is why a lot of techniques involve breathing, because we can control that heart rate variability or those nervous system states. And so here we can see that there is some regulation. Compared to that, say, a heart rate variability assessment here, you can see it's a little bit more shaky. We can tell when you're breathing, but not as extreme as the other one. So this can be like, okay, that nervous system's stuck more in a fight or flight state. And then when we have more drops downs like this, this one's more, the other ones are 1 minute. This is a 5 minute, so that's why it looks a bit different. But these are going to be more of those dorsal vagal intrusions. So going more into that pain or overwhelm, disassociation, immobilization, where it's just like, okay, we just need to shut down for right now. It's like our last ditch effort. This is what we would see on a brain map if it's like, this is a tendency more to go into the dorsal vagal response. So we can see these different regions of the brain or how the nervous system reacts or where they might be stuck. And then what we do from a neurofeedback perspective specifically is we target and help to rewire and integrate what has caused that upregulation in the nervous system. So I just wanted to incorporate some of this data just because it's cool. It's always cool to see how brains are reacting, what we can see in that side of things, and then how we can actually train it with neurofeedback and then have this data along the way to compare and contrast how things have changed. And it's always cool to see that objective data. Of course, people will be able to tell the difference of like, oh yeah, I'm not reacting as much. But then when you see the data, it's like, oh yeah, this is actually pretty cool that we can test these things and treat these things, right, and have that information. So really with all of this info, I'll look at the questions just in a second here, but you know, when there is trauma, there is going to be changes in the brain, which then are going to change the way that our nervous system is going to respond to situations, which can basically keep us in a state where we're more reactive to situations. And then what we want to do is basically unlearn these habits and patterns to get that nervous system back to a place, or brain back to a place where it does feel safe, so that we can, of course, heal or whatever your life goals are, start that business, run that race, and meet those goals where we're at, versus just being in more of the survival state, getting back into that thrive state. Maybe I'll just read these out loud. So I'm in my 20s and tried all the time despite sleeping 8 hours per night and exercising daily. I've taken various supplements, but nothing works. What do I recommend to try? Is this for sleep? Oh, no. I imagine this is specifically for nervous system regulation. I'm not quite sure I understand the question, but usually when it comes to supplements specifically for nervous system regulation or support, there's nothing going to be like that golden ticket to help integrate this information. So whenever I use supplements, when it comes to this activation, they're typically more, I don't know if that's going to be this, sorry, hand raise, I don't know if it's related to that. Typically, I would use more supplements as, okay, if we are activated or we are triggered, what can we use to help calm the nervous system? A lot of those can be more like herbs that are called nervines. So if there are something like passion flower, lemon balm, hops, these are going to help kind of relax or get us out of that state where we are more activated or triggered. Or if we need something more of like a nutrient support, so vitamins and minerals to help with like the nerve firing function or adrenal glands, if that is really taxed, adrenal support or adaptogens for adrenal glands is what I would use to help support, almost as like a band-aid approach, but typically doesn't work if there is this amygdala upregulation. That's not going to touch those brain regions. So it's kind of like a two parts to the puzzle, two-pronged approach there. So how do we shift out of freeze state? Yeah, to experience life again. So that's more of, yeah, that dorsal vagal shutdown. So the first thing is going to be that we want to acknowledge why we're there or what has caused us to be in that freeze state. So that awareness is going to be huge. And then we want to understand, like, so why is this happening? What caused this to happen? Really, is that reason that we're stuck there an absolute truth? Is this actually the truth of the matter? And then it is going to feel pretty uncomfortable to come out of that because we have to go through that fight or flight response again. And so that is where we do want that support relationship with somebody who can provide that safety to help guide and potentially bring awareness to some of those things that we can't see. Of course, we all have blinders on, right? So we need somebody able to point that out for us and then help to move back. Again, from a, like, at our clinic, we do use neurofeedback. So that is usually what I would recommend to somebody who's stuck in that state, and really how neurofeedback works. We do this imaging that I did show you, and then we provide the brain with positive reinforcement when we're helping shift it out of that state. And we can actually also show the body and brain what more of that rest and digest, or what the slower brainwave frequencies are, to help train it to become more familiar with it, right? Because if we're used to freeze all the time, then that's going to be what we're looking to, because that's familiar. And so it's going to feel uncomfortable to shift that state. So yeah, neurofeedback would be the tool that I typically use with that. But there are a lot of other therapies out there that do help there with that as well. This kind of answers the next question too. So if there is, yeah, always in that survival mode, on edge, and like a lot of other potentially counseling or medication hasn't worked, supplements don't work, it's going to be usually that we are in that overdrive. And so I do recommend neurofeedback. I do see amazing things and treatments with that. Potentially there's a lot of information on our website about that, but also if you do reach out to us, we can also provide more information about how that works. But basically, again, it's just guiding back our state back into something that feels familiar. The best supplements for anxiety, trouble sleeping, racing thoughts, and dysregulation. So I would kind of separate a couple of those. The dysregulation, again, kind of going back to why that's dysregulated. The racing thoughts, what are we thinking about, is actually a really good question. What are we thinking about? What is that pattern that keeps coming up and up and up? Because there's going to be something in that for us. Trouble sleeping, I'm going to assume that's due to the racing thoughts. But sleep and anxiety, and sleep, of course, from like a supplemental approach, there are going to be the things like whether they're indicated or not, but from a research perspective, like melatonin, 5-HTP, magnesium can be really good. Anxiety, a lot more anti-inflammatory. Saffron has some really good research with it for that too. And so again, those can help more from a symptomatic approach. And sometimes, of course, if we're sleeping better, then our anxiety's down. So it can be more of like that chicken and egg there. So those would be some things that I would try first, if you haven't tried those ones yet. And then kind of, though, we can use those to help with regulation, where we can get to a place where we're feeling a bit more regulated and a little bit more safe with from the supplements. Can someone still experience trauma despite having many of their needs yet? Yes, I would definitely. A lot of the times I will work with people where their immediate reaction to that trauma would be no. There hasn't been any trauma, but where we see in the brain map or something has been activated, and there again, there doesn't, like, it could be all their needs can be met. They were taken care of. They were financially supported. They had a roof over their head. They had clothes. They had all of these things. And it's like, yeah, my childhood was pretty good, but they still usually will develop some sort of narrative or story internally, and that now is going to drive how they show up in this world. And so there's definitely ways that we can get to the root of that, or we can see how potentially our current patterns are preventing us from healing or keeping us stuck in that fight or flight. So yes, definitely there can still be trauma without it being more of like that blatant obvious, like almost like those big things where what we think of trauma. Yes, it can be like just slow underneath the surface comments from caregivers, people at school that can drive that trauma response as well. Can taking probiotics for digestive issues have an impact on the brain through the gut-brain connection? Great question. So yes, so we talked mostly about trauma that's causing upregulation of the amygdala. Trauma is not the only thing that can cause us to be in that sympathetic dominant state. There are chronic infection, mold in the house, infections in your gut. And so when there's other things that are going on too that are driving that sympathetic nervous system state or that fight or flight, we do want to address those. So probiotics can help with digestive imbalances to then help calm the brain down so it's not always in that state. Absolutely. If you're always wired and can't sleep, what can you do to settle the brain down? Kind of like that wired and tired, I imagine, where the brain's ruminating. So one of the things that we're like, with settling the brain down, I really like, if you guys haven't tried this, but like writing everything down out, get it out of your brain onto something else. Because if it's just ruminating and going around and around and around in your brain, it's just going to keep going. So if it's like, okay, I'm going to make myself a deal, I'm going to put this on a piece of paper, we can revisit it in the morning, and at least getting it out, that can be really helpful. I also like journaling and writing that down, because now we can actually start to see patterns over and again. Okay, is there something every night? Is it work stress? Is it fear about something? Like there can be a pattern that can help us get into the underlying root cause of what's always driving that, because it might be a bit of a different narrative. It might be that, it's work one night and relationship the next night and then this, but there might be a common theme underneath, and that can really help by getting that out of the brain. There are other things that also, of course, can impact this as well. Like if we're not eating enough food, or we have more anxiety, or blood sugar dysregulation is happening, then we do want to look into those things as well to help rule them out, because then that can help from the sleep perspective. Or like, God, is there enough serotonin converting into melatonin? So there's all these other things that can lead into that too. But right off the bat, that's what I would try, is get everything from your brain out, so it's not, your brain's just not going a mile a minute. Is it possible to calm these symptoms when one is in physical pain? That is a really great question. So definitely layers to this, in the sense of, is your physical pain causing your brain to upregulate? Is your brain upregulating causing your physical pain? Because definitely trauma can cause that physical pain. And so usually I work in tandem when there's both things happening. So if there's only emotional trauma that's causing physical pain, then yes, that's going to be the way through. We have to, the only way to get through that pain and to calm the brain is going to be how we have to go through that, if that makes sense. Versus that, say, if we're in physical pain because there's Lyme disease and we have trauma, then we typically treat those things in tandem at the same time, so that we can get to a place where the body's healing completely. And of course, that pain is going to be a signal, but it's a signal. Those symptoms are telling your brain something's wrong. We just got to figure out what that thing that is wrong. What strategies do you recommend for healing childhood trauma? So yes, there's tons. And really, I do think that this, if you have like more of an intuitive pull to one, but if there is like the CBT, EMDR, neurofeedback, somatic therapy, all of these, like somatic therapy is more of, if you've read the book, How Your Body Keeps the Score. So our body's always going to know what's going to go on, and it's going to have memories. So any of these would be really good places to start with that. And I would just pick one that you're more called to, and then start there, is kind of how I would go about that to help with that, because they all can provide really good relief or integration. for childhood trauma. Yeah, how many biofeedback sessions are necessary to notice improvement? So typically on average, we do 24 sessions to start to see if like that's on average where we notice the most change. When we do neurofeedback, we do them in sessions of 8. So we do 8 sessions, typically a protocol update, 8 sessions, protocol update, and 8 sessions. And then we do more data collection. So we'd actually be able to compare and contrast the two maps to see how things have moved. So I would say an average of 24 sessions. A lot of people that I work with, when they do more than 24 sessions, it's because they're actually noticing a benefit. It's not something that you do for like years and years at a time. It's like, okay, there's a goal of this treatment, this 3-month program. And then if we're going above and beyond that, it's like, okay, we're actually noticing something here. Ooh, yeah. Okay, what do you suggest to help heal the brain and nervous system after a bad surgical experience that has left someone in chronic pain? So, is the chronic pain near the surgical experience? Because actually, if that's, you can reset the nerve pathways with something called perineural therapy, which is what I would recommend. Dr. Nelson at our clinic does do this, so he would be a good one to chat with. But what happens, depending on where the pain's coming from, but when we do go through chronic surgery, or sorry, like a surgical experience, we are typically cutting the nerves. And so when that communication doesn't heal effectively, we want to reset that nerve pathway, because if the brain is taking information from where that surgery area is and it's like there's still pain here, really we can just do injections to reset that nerve pathway. So that's actually would be where I would start. Hopefully that's just like all you would need to take care of that. And it's called perineural therapy. Yes, limbic retraining for addressing trauma. If this is like kind of like the DNRS, yes, it works really well for some people. So that is a really great option, again, to get that limbic system, or that like the amygdala and hippocampus that are part of that limbic system from not firing. Yeah, really good. Okay, so yeah, I mentioned what's the process at our clinic. So yeah, I mentioned the 24 sessions. Typically what that looks like though is you're coming in for, it's a 2-hour appointment for a brain map. And then after that brain map, we would meet, we'd look at what's going on there. And then a protocol is developed right from that brain map. And then there's that 24 sessions. So again, usually it's twice a week for 4 weeks. And each session for approximate cost is $170 for the neurofeedback there. Yeah, if I could make a perfect concoction of herbs and a tea. So there's a lot of great teas out there, is why I'm just hesitating here, so that I usually will recommend people to try. And then I'll tell you my favorite herbs. So traditional medicinals, they have like Cup of Calm, they have a lavender lemon balm. Those I really like to incorporate when people really love teas, if they're like not going to make anything. The other teas, if you're like into making things, I love like Schisandra is a really nice tasting. If like blood pressure is okay, I really like licorice from that standpoint. And then we do want some of those more like sedating and calming nervines. So passion flower, lavender is really good. That's kind of a really floral mix. If you're putting those all together, it might be too potent from a taste perspective. I'm missing one. Skullcap. That one's a really great one as well. So a couple of those you can incorporate together, and basically they're going to nourish our nervous system. And so when we're really in that like heightened state, then that can help. There's actually like I have a supplement right here, but Biomed from like Neuroplex. I really like this formula as well for nervous system. It's like very calming. So that one's good too. Ooh, low energy. So totally. So low energy with sleeping well, with eating well, exercising daily. My one question with that would be, does exercise give you more energy or less energy? But if it's more from a nervous system side of things, basically if your brain or amygdala are in this upregulated state, your brain is going to be using a ton of energy all the time to be on in the background. And so if it is nervous system related, integrating that information to free up that energy. Definitely blood work from a perspective of like iron, B12, what's your thyroid, what is your nutrient status there, would be my next kind of low hanging fruit. And then if that is all good, and this is more like chronic fatigue for a long period of time, that's where then I typically look more into environmental exposures like mold, like Lyme disease, Epstein-Barr virus, which is what causes mono, something else that's really impacting your energy production cycle, that's where I would look next after kind of the nutritional deficiencies, nervous system. Then is there actually something that's blocking you from producing energy effectively? Are there any specific fruits and vegetables that help support brain and cognitive health? From a nutrition perspective, I would actually go more with healthy fats. So omega-3s, DHA specifically is going to be really great for the brain. Of course, you can do that from like a fish perspective. Olive oil is going to be really great. Nuts and seeds, but making sure you're getting enough healthy fats in there would be my best nutritional recommendation for that. Does biofeedback even work if you are severely on edge? Yes. So we do biofeedback, but we also work with heart rate variability. So we can do like more of like a vagus nerve training as well. So we don't just do the biofeedback. We have other mechanisms or treatment modalities that we would use on edge to help, again, guide your system back to a place where you're not so on edge. And then when we are doing treatment, we really are targeting. So if, let's say, like your limbic system is upregulated because there's memories that were firing, then we want to integrate those memories. So we're not just trying to like balance the brainwave frequencies so everything's normal. It's like we still want to treat why those brainwave frequencies are imbalanced. So yes, that can be really helpful. And a lot of feedback I have gotten is like when they are doing neurofeedback or biofeedback is, you know, after a round or after a couple of sessions that they do feel like they have more capacity and you know, nothing in their life has actually changed in order for this to feel like this. It's like, okay, we've just been able to get the nervous system a little bit more to a place where they don't feel on edge or feel more anxiety or whatever symptoms they're experiencing. So yes, it does still do good things. Is perfectionism part of being on edge? Yeah, and then the guilt of not reaching or doing the multiple goals. So yes, like perfectionism would be, so something that, say, we'll just make the story up, but in general, when you were little, a need wasn't met in a way, or something happened and that narrative was created. Okay, if I am perfect, then I will get X, Y, Z. Or when I reach multiple goals, when I earn more money, when I reach this status, when I do then I will get that need met. And then typically what happens as we're an adult and we get more awareness is like, okay, that need, like I didn't do that thing. And now we have that guilt and shame that's festering in the background that's going to pull us back into that sympathetic dominance response so that we continue to show up that way. So it is going to continue to keep you in that elevated state because now that narrative or that perfectionism or reaching those goals is actually pulling you out of your authenticity, right? Like it's not necessarily that you don't want to reach that goal, right? I want that promotion, but if I want that promotion in a really authentic way, it's going to feel really good. Versus if I want that promotion because that's where I'm getting my self-worth, I'm just making this up, then it's not going to feel really good and it's going to pull my nervous system out of that rest and digest or into that fight or flight. So it's really that kind of angle that we're coming at that same goal from, which is going to drive where our nervous system is going to fall within that. So yeah, it can definitely drive being on edge. And then your system's always looking for like, what's the next thing I can be perfect at, right? So are there any situations or conditions in which neurofeedback wouldn't work or be recommended? Yes. Would it work for someone with it? Yeah, with an eating disorder if the brain is undernourished? Great question. So there are reasons that we would do a brain map and then not recommend neurofeedback. And so a couple of those are if, let's say there is, with SIRS that I work with, this chronic inflammatory response syndrome, you know, if there's mold in their home and it's like, okay, we just really don't think that the needle is going to move with neurofeedback yet, then usually we do other treatment modalities first in order to get their body to a place where that neurofeedback will work effectively. If we don't have the nutrient stores that we need in order for the brain to hold that state, then of course, yes, we want to replenish the body with those energy reserves, whether that's nutrition, whether that's, let's say, like, you know, oxygen or other therapies that we would use in order to get them to that state. But a lot of times we can also do that in tandem. So it's not necessarily like we need to wait in order to do that. Like the mold and that inflammation, we might actually wait in order to do that. But that initial brain map will tell us if we do want to move forward with training. Like, is this actually going to be appropriate, or should we wait and do some behind the scenes work before we come to neurofeedback? And so, yes, there's reasons that we wouldn't do it. I wouldn't say for sure that being like undernourished if we don't have nutrition is fully like absolute no, but we would want to see where you're at with that. And then depending if there are treatments that you would be interested in, if it's like, okay, we just need some nutrients like IV therapy that we can get into the system that can help fill kind of some of those cups, or if it just does take a little bit more time where we can replenish through, of course, food and nutrition that way, then we can do that as well. So yeah, we would usually be able to tell off the first brain map, but that's also something, if you are interested, we can talk about before you do sign up for that. Type of magnesium usually recommended for sleep. So magnesium bisglycinate is typically the one recommended for sleep, or magnesium glycinate. Bisglycinate just means 2 glycine molecules. Magnesium attached to glycine, which is the molecule. Glycine helps to drop body temperature, which is going to naturally happen to initiate sleep. You won't notice the difference. You won't be like, wow, I'm cold before bed, but that's going to be the best one. Then, of course, there's malate, threonate, which I would be okay with those people taking that for sleep too. They're not as specific for sleep, but really the magnesium is what we want as well. So those are going to be really bioavailable versus something like magnesium oxide and citrate. They're going to irritate your bowel wall. And if you take too much, you're going to have diarrhea. So unless you have constipation, I typically don't give those. The other forms are going to be better. But yeah, bisglycinate is going to be the best. Sugar cravings. So if it's sugar cravings due to being in a sympathetic dominant state all the time, because that's like our quick source of energy, then of course we want to basically be able to get that nervous system back to a place where it can use our fat stores for fuel so that we're not relying on that sugar. If that sugar is coming, sugar craving is coming from a yeast overgrowth, which is very common, then you got to bring down the yeast levels. So yes, when there is childhood trauma, it can lead to like be connected with weight, of course. And so again, when there's childhood trauma, we have that fight or flight response. We have higher levels of cortisol. Cortisol is going to be store, because maybe in the future when I'm running away from that line, I need this energy stores, which is going to be our fat cells, that nutrition that we're storing, to then I can use that energy to do something and run away. And so what we really want to do from a weight perspective, of course, look at insulin, because those can be connected there too. But again, get cortisol levels down back to a place where your body feels safe to lose that weight. So I always like to think of weight as like nutrition. How much nutrition do we need? And so if that is store, then yeah, of course it's going to be really hard, or everything you're eating, we're just going to store because it doesn't feel safe. And so it's, with that negative self-talk, I would really try, again, it's always about like these patterns. So what is the pattern behind that? If it's just everything negative, then for every one negative thought, we need 3 positive thoughts. That's like a very drastic difference. And so it's, one, having compassion with yourself. We're going to have negative thoughts. So when they come up, we don't need to beat ourselves up about it. No, like shame or guilt. We need to have so much grace for ourselves. We're learning. This is your first time here on earth. And so it's like, okay, we're going to have grace. We're going to have grace as we go through this. And then slowly over time, we're going to really find that pattern and change that negative self-talk, learn why that negative self-talk is there, right? And you might know already, like there's childhood abuse and abandonment there. And so, okay, when that happened, there's going to be a narrative that you took on. We want to figure out that narrative. Is that narrative true? It's not going to be true. And then, so then we can change that narrative, and slowly over time, we can work our way out of that. But there's absolutely like a hormonal connection for sure with the nervous system with that. Does biofeedback improve back pain? So it would depend why the back pain's there. If it is, so with our sympathetic nerves, they are going to exit our spine at our neck and at our low back. So if it is fully like that's the only thing, then yes, it can help if we're not in that rest and digest. If the low back pain is there because of like musculoskeletal issues, a bulge disc, posture, anything like that, then typically that would be the first place that I would start with that. twice per week for how often people typically come in for biofeedback to start. It's usually twice per week. Some people after that will go down to once per week, but yes, twice per week. Yeah. What would you recommend for someone who is still exposed to the person who's caused trauma? So other things, so when there's still people in our environment that are causing that trauma, yes, the supplements here that you mentioned, those are things that we can use. Other things like breathing techniques, if you tried that, can be really helpful, which is probably where I would start to help self-regulate again, kind of with that, those heart rate variabilities up and down. Knowing if we can regulate heart math is a good one to look at, but helping with that heart rate variability. So in those moments, you can regulate, basically take that minute again, get that prefrontal cortex back online. So it's like, okay, yes, we're having this trauma that's here and it's just going to be in the background, but how can I change that internal reaction to that situation? So yeah, anything that can help regulate, which would be probably breathing in that moment. Not in that moment, but other things that can help is like yoga or these things, like other or techniques that can help with that downshift or ability to increase the capacity within the nervous system. Yeah, okay. Oh yes, the name of this supplement is called Neuroplex. It's backwards here, but it's by Biomed. I like this one. Yeah. If anyone has a Fullscript account, it would be on there. Yeah, I'm not sure if it's on Amazon, but it's worth a look. Yeah, treatment-resistant depression. We're getting really out of the box here, but kind of the newer information on, not out of the box for that question, out of the box for my response. So a lot of more new information or research behind treatment-resistant depression, potentially more ketamine therapy, if you've heard of that. There are a couple clinics in the city that do that, and I have had some patients do that, and you can get approved through their facilities to do that type of treatment. So that's kind of like, again, we're like broadening the scope where we can do something like that, but that's where some of the newer research sits for the treatment-resistant side of things. Is there a difference between neurofeedback or biofeedback? So basically, neurofeedback is a type of biofeedback. So there are other ways to, or yes, there are other ways to do biofeedback that would be different than the neurofeedback that we're doing. Great question. How do I tell if you have mold in your house? Can you see it? That'd be number one. If you don't know, do you have any water damage spots? So if there's any like that brown ring or like kind of rippling in the ceiling or floor or baseboards, if you have mold in your shower, like anything like that, if there's a musty smell, that's going to be actinobacteria. So there are like these signs or cues that you can use to see. If you can't see anything and you don't know, then something called an ERMI, ERMI, is going to be the best test that you can do to swab your home to see if there's mold. It's from a company called Envirobiomics, and basically you don't dust your house for 2 weeks. They'll send you this kit, you dust your house, you send it back, and they'll be able to tell you if there's mold spores. That is going to be the best kit test above and beyond air sampling that you can get for that. So, but if you have any visible spots, I mean, it's still good to test, but then it's probably likely that it's there. But yeah, definitely that musty smell. The musty smell is going to come from something called actinobacteria, which typically is more toxic to our system than the mold itself, and they're going to grow together. And then actinobacteria can also grow on our skin and be stuck to our clothes and our carpets and our furniture. So we can take it from house to house, which is a little bit different than mold that we typically see. So yeah, the test is called an ERMI, ERMI, and it's from a company called Envirobiomics. If you do want to do that kind of like Swiffer test like that. Awesome.
Thank you everybody for asking so many wonderful questions. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your night And thank you, Dr. Amy Morrison. That was brilliant. We do offer a complimentary discovery call. It's technically step 1 in our process. Learn a little bit more about what we do, see if it's the right fit for you. And, if that's not the case, we generally have other recommendations. But yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you all for coming.